Hello, today we're going to take a look at the Product Design Technical Group. The Product Design Technical Group works on developing consumer products such as hardware and software for various everyday items. So some examples of that would be the Kodak cameras, Xerox copiers, office furniture, and power tools. So what the Product Design Technical Group looks at is concept development. So the Product Design Technical Group will work with engineers to aid with communication of specific specifications and measurements of the different products. So they would move through the design phase from concept to prototype, then they would do the actual engineering, then they would move into beta testing, and then product sales. And then there's research at each of those phases. So human factors does play a key role in product design and research and development. And we can take a closer look by examining the Proceedings paper titled Development and Usability of a Novel Holographic Three-Dimensional User Interface Using Hand Gesture Control for Future Vehicle Applications by Older Adults.
Okay, so our kind of Proceedings paper looked at moving forward with design inside of an automobile. They called their thing the Deep Orange Project. The researchers in this case were 17 automotive engineering graduate students, 1 transportation design student, and the project goal was to minimize the design of an interior inside of a car. So if you go ahead and click the next one. So their outcome, they called it the Friendly Artificial Companion Electronics. They used a screen from a tablet to project onto 3 blades. You can kind of see this right here. That's a visual representation of it. And then they wanted to see if the use of hand gestures to manipulate functions on this 3D holographic screen was useful in their minimalist design. And their thought process was that instead of actually having the buttons and stuff that you have to direct your attention towards, if you have these hand gestures that could kind of manipulate your functions and you could see it on that screen, you wouldn't be distracted as much. So go ahead and click the next one. For the materials that they used for the actual experiment part of what they did, they had 12 participants, 6 males, 6 females. They were aged from 68 to 89, so they were looking at an older population for their study. They all had driver's license. The study took place over 3 phases. They had the exploration phase, an exploration with a hint, which were kind of the same, but they studied them differently. Then explanation with demonstration, and then the guided practice phase. And then whenever they actually had the participants in the room, they had the holographic display set up on this raised table. They matched the display with their where their eyes were, and so they also set up the gesture tracker in the beginning to have it set up in the same place. And then later on, when they would move to next phases, the gesture tracker would be somewhere where their hand was, so they could see it kind of more in like an artificial driving type situation. So go ahead.
Alright, so now we have the procedure. This is an example of how they had the participants set up in the study. This right here is the motion sensor, and this is, as you can see, the display, the 3D holographic display that they had. Go ahead, next slide. So for the test, using the motion sensor, they had 3 main tasks. One was moving the skull front to the front or to the background, back and forth. One was making the flowers bigger and smaller to the edge of the display, or about the size that they were originally. And another one was moving the skull to the left or moving the skull to the right near other flowers. This is an example of each one. So this one you can see that the skull's in the front, and this is the skull in the back. This would be the flowers being small, and this is the flowers being bigger. And then these two, you can see the skulls moving either to the left or to the right. The exploration phases. So for the first one, it was a pure exploration. There was no real directions were given. They were told to complete the task. About half the people end up using the sensor as a mouse, moving it along the table. After the researchers decided to give a small hint saying that the sensor was actually motion control, most of them decided to start using it correctly, but about 30% of them still used it as a trackpad.
All right, so now we're going to take a look at the guided practices, and by the first round, at the beginning of the first round, 33% of the correct motions were being used. when looking at the flower task, and that was increasing the size of the flower. 17% correct motions were used during the skull task, which was moving the skull to the right. And then by the 5th attempt of round 1, 67% of the correct motions were used during the flower task, where it was making the flower larger. 8% 8% correct motions were used during the skull and the flower task, where you were moving the skull to the right and minimizing the flower to a smaller size as well. You can see over on this graph here, right down here is showing the task for the flower, as minimizing it as well as moving the skull to the right. Overall, performance increased as the rounds and trials continued. Performance was at its best in the 3rd round, and then 85% of the correct motions were used for moving the skull to the back, which is shown right up here on that graph there. So moving on to the discussion, the results indicated that the system was not intuitively designed, especially for older adults. The sensor that they had used was mostly being used as either a mouse or a trackpad. And then also, even after being helped with the guided practice and having hints, they continued to struggle with the required task. And some of the limitations, without understanding how to use a sensor bar, that led to the participants getting frustrated and just disappointed with themselves. And then also, the sensor had specific limitations where the hand had to be held out above with the fingers being spread apart, otherwise it wasn't being registered properly. So the future research for this one, or for this experiment that they had described, was that they could consider the placement of the sensor in a different position within the interior of the car, and then also using a different sensor that's a little bit more useful and more reliable, and considering more age groups instead of just looking at that age group that they had looked at previously. Oh.